Good morning, everybody. We're on page 32b of Tractate Rosh Hashanah as we steam towards the exciting conclusion of our Masechet with absolutely no pace or speed whatsoever, luxuriating and enjoying all of the words of our sages and rabbis. We are back here in the Lehman Center. Yes, what?
Rabbi Mark, I hope that the two rabbis who came on the mission had reported back that they had the pleasure of meeting myself and Marion.
Well, they have not.
If they didn't, excommunicate them.
Remember who they were? Was one of them Rabbi Andy?
Yes, it was great to see him. Had quite a conversation with him, and also with Rabbi Edelson.
Good. I will. I haven't seen Rabbi Adelson much lately because he's been on vacation for a week and a half, and I go on vacation tomorrow. So we'll cross paths. We're gonna pick it up here on page 32b. The subnote for you in Safaria, Cindy, is 0.13. So if you scroll down to where the little note says 13, that's where we're picking up. And for all those at home, we left off just really quickly to kind of sum up. We've been kind of exploring the concept of the fact that there are 10 verses in Malchuyot, 10 verses in Zichronot, 10 verses in Shofarot that should be said. What are the qualifications for what makes a verse appropriate? And this is really where we're picking up today, so it shouldn't be too much trouble for you all to understand. I made that a little bit bigger for all of our small little eyes. There, that's perfect. So if it's supposed to be an even number from Torah, Nevi'im, and Ketuvim, that would be, and Ilanit is our standing math professor here, right? 3 doesn't divide evenly into 10. So what do you do with the 10th verse? And so that's where we're picking up right now. Although it's a little bit confusing because they don't really say that it's the 10th verse that we're arguing about. They just say how we start and how we end. All right, with that, Elisheva, I'm going to have you read the English, if it's okay by you, and I'll do the Hebrew and Aramaic here. Matchil b'Torah u'mashlim b'Nevi'im, Rabbi Yossi Omer, im hishlim b'Torah yatsa, im hishlim di'avad, im in, lahatchila la, v'hatanya Rabbi Yossi, hamashlim b'Torah hareze meshubach, ema mashlim.
The Mishnah taught, when reciting the 10 verses, one begins with verses from the Torah and concludes with verses from the prophets. Rabbi Yossi says, if he concluded with a verse from the Torah, he has fulfilled his obligation. The Gemara notes that Rabbi Yossi's formulation, if he concluded, indicates that after the fact, yes, he has fulfilled his obligation. Ab initio, no. He has not fulfilled his obligation to recite the necessary verses. The Gemara asks, but isn't it taught in a Baraita that Rabbi Yossi says? You just moved it off my screen.
I did?
Mm-hmm. Yeah. Or somebody did. One who concludes the series of verses with a verse from the Torah is praiseworthy. The Gemara answers, say that the text of the Mishnah must be modified so that it reads, Rabbi Yossi says, he concludes with a verse from the Torah. That is, one should do so ab initio.
Okay, so we'll go back.
That's a total contradiction.
Sort of. So we'll unpack, and all of you will help me to understand this also. The most important thing is for me is the basic, right? The first thing that's a little bit tricky is just when they use Latin instead of Hebrew, Aramaic, or even Yiddish, I'm mostly at a loss. Like ab initio doesn't do anything for me.
It means from the beginning.
Right. But for me, I only understand the terms from inside the Gemara, which is the concept of lahatchila b'diavad, which we've already talked about a couple weeks ago, but I'll remind us all. This is the concept of if you do something, there's a proper way to do something beforehand, but there's another way to do it. If you did it the wrong way, the question is, have you fulfilled your obligation? So a classic that I kind of brought up last time, like let's say you're doing Amidah, the morning Amidah, and you do go through the whole prayer, and you haven't gotten to Sim Shalom, and just before you get to Sim Shalom, you go, oh crap, it's Rosh Chodesh. I'm supposed to say Yale v'yadvo. What do I do? And the answer is, before you say Sim Shalom, you would go back and say, you flip back 3 pages in the prayer book, and you'd say Yale v'yavo, and then you go back and flip 3 pages forward to go to Sim Shalom. Now, does that mean that you should always do Yale v'yavo right, after Modim and after Ritzei, but before Sim Shalom? No. You should do it where it actually appears in the Siddur, if you do it the right way, right? There are a dozen other examples of this. I told you guys all the story of the Sukkah, right? Where the Lahatchila way to do it right is skach on the top, walls on afterwards. But b'diavad, if you do your walls, and you can continue and do your skach. Okay. So, anyways, that's thing one. So the reason that this all feels like review is we've already had a lahatchila b'diavad situation with the 10 verses, right? If you remember back about a month, we were dealing with the question of whether you fulfill your obligation with 7 verses or whether you fulfill your obligation with 10. And the rabbis are arguing about whether 7 is a lahatchila position or whether 10 is the lahatchila position and 7 is the b'diavad position, right? Which means, like, the rabbis may say, like, 7's fine, or no, 10's fine, but if you only get to 7, you're also okay, right? So now we're into a situation where we're arguing about what are the verses that are the right verses for this situation, right? So the Mishnah's statement is, start with Torah and conclude with prophets. Now, there are 2 ways, of course, to understanding it, which is maybe one of the reasons why Elisha was confused, although maybe not. There's one way to understand this, which is probably incorrect, but by the way, there's an oral kind of understanding of Gemara where some yeshiva teacher will say, there's only one way to understand this. And there's only one way to understand this if you understand that your teacher in rabbinical school or your teacher at Lakewood Yeshiva said it this way, and therefore it can't possibly be another way. Once you go down into the back of a Gemara and you see the Shita Mekubetset and the Rosh and the Rif and the Ran and all these other guys who have other opinion, and Rashi and Tosfot, you see that you can unread anything and reread it another way as long as it doesn't become total, chaos. So there's 2 ways to understand this. Way one to understand this is that you would go 3 verses of Torah, 3 verses of Ketuvim, and finish with 4 verses of Nevi'im, of prophets, okay? The other way to understand it, which as we read through the Gemara is basically the way they are going to understand it, is 3 verses of Torah, 3 verses of Nevi'im, 3 verses of Ketuvim, 1 final verse of Nevi, right, of prophets. Okay, so we're going to work off of that assumption, which is actually different than what we were talking about 2 weeks ago, because I was a bit of a neophyte at this section of the Gemara. Any questions up till here? I know I just threw a lot of information at everybody.
That last verse, that's supposed to be Torah, right? The very last verse, isn't that what they're saying?
So, right,
Not
so be here now, right? That was just where I was with the Mishnah. So now we go to the next line. So Cindy asked a question, which was brilliant because Cindy understands the objection. Rabbi Yossi says, if he concluded with a verse of Torah, he has fulfilled his obligations. So the Mishnah's standard, which is interesting, is Torah, 3 Nevi'im, 3 Ketuvim, 1 Navi. Okay. Rabbi Yossi says 3 Torah, 3 Nevi'im, 3 Ketuvim, conclude with Torah. Go back to the Chamesh, Bobby, and do it that way. Okay. So we have a disagreement. Now, the standard, of course, as you all know, is that the Mishnah is the authoritative text. And unless the Gemara will come to read Rabbi Yossi against the Mishnah and make a cogent argument for why ultimately Rabbi Yossi is the way we should hold. As you all know, for instance, like the Hillel Shammai debate about candles is another example of this. Now, we all know that we hold like Hillel, and that's why we light 1 and then 2 and then 3, instead of going the way Beit Shammai says Hanukkah, 8 and then 7 and then 6. But if you want to be a true conservative Jew, capital C, the conservative movement generally, if a bunch of rabbis of the conservative movement say, this Tosefta we threw out 2,000 years ago, it has a good point. You could hold like that. And I do have a colleague who does light his menorahs both ways. He has 2 menorahs. He lights one 8, he lights one 1, right? He's a lunatic, by the way.
That's like
but
people who wear 2 sets of tefillin every day.
similar but different, but yes, that's the whole
Yeah, but
Rabbeinu
it's
Tam thing.
different opinions.
Yes.
And they're doing both.
You know why Rabbeinu Tam tefillin exist, right?
No, wow.
It's
So-
not the details, no.
So I'll tell you really quickly, just because it's an interesting point, because you would think there's a huge difference between the tefillin. There's not, okay? All the rabbis in the Talmud agree about what verses should be in your head tefillin. There's 4 little compartments, and there's a different section in each one. The disagreement is between Rashi and his grandson Rabbeinu Tam about what order you put them in. So the 2 sets of tefillin that a man wears on his head, one is, I think it's Exodus, Deuteronomy, Numbers, and the other one is Exodus, Numbers, Deuteronomy. That's the only difference. They're the same words, they're just in a different order. Right, which is why you very rarely see people wear Rabbeinu Tam tefillin, because there are very few people who say like, this angers up my blood, it's got to be this way, you know? By the way, I think, to be fair, I think Rabbeinu Tam makes more sense, right? They're chronologically arranged. They appear in this order in the Torah, and therefore that's the way they should appear in the box on my head. But Rashi disagrees, and as we all know, we generally follow Rashi. All right, let's keep going.
Thank you.
The Gemara. Oh, sorry. Go ahead, Olivia.
There's no before or after in the Torah, Rabbi.
Yes, right. So if you're muchzik, if you're machmir on the idea ein mukdam u'meuchar b'Torah, there is no forward and backward, upwards or downwards in Torah, then you hold like Olivia, and therefore, now remember, you wear both sets of tefillin at the same time. There is no one who, as far as I know, who owns Rabbeinu Tam tefillin and doesn't wear both the Rabbeinu Tam and the Rashi at the same time. So Rabbeinu Tam tefillin people are really, really careful. They basically think, I think Rabbeinu Tam had a good point, but just in case I'm wrong, I'll put Rashi on right above them, right? I had a colleague who bought Rabbeinu, she had inherited a lot of money from her 3rd husband. And so she wore her Rabbeinu Tam tefillin on Tuesdays and Thursdays, and her Rashi tefillin on Mondays, Wednesdays, and Fridays. And that's because she could afford to own 2 sets of tefillin, one of which is, more. All right, Judy has a question, and then Elisheva, I'll answer your question. Go ahead, Rev Judy.
Okay, so the reason that there's no beginning, there's no before and after, there's no chronology in how you approach Torah. Was that something that the later rabbis did? In other words, post even Mishnaic times, because they wanted to play with the text. And the best way to play with the text is to just take whatever you want from the text and mix it up and create something new.
It's a good question.
No, I'm not being facetious
No,
now.
no, right.
No,
So-
you're right.
So there's a good question.
There's a question mark at the end of that.
Yeah. It's a good question as to when it happens. I'm not sure if it's Mishnah or Gemara. My guess would be Gemara in the Gemaraic era. That's not really a word. The Amoraic era is the correct academic pronunciation. My recollection is that it stems from one specific story in the Torah, which is just problematic enough in terms of its chronology that it necessitated this kind of move by the rabbis. And that's the story of the golden calf, because the golden calf story appears after the giving of the 10 commandments and after the giving of all of Parshat Mishpatim. And so in that understanding, right, there's this really weird, like, kind of thing where, we hear the 10 commandments, and then we get into the next parsha after that, and we get all the laws given, and then we go to the next parsha, Kitisa, and Moses comes down. Moses is still up the mountain, right? And they're having a dance party down at the bottom of the mountain where I love the scene in 10 Commandments where the women are whipping their hair over the bull. That's my favorite part. I don't know why. I could take or leave the entire thing of the 10 Commandments. There's this moment where there are these lasciviously dressed women rubbing their hair on the bull. And I'm just like, that's interesting, anyways. But so that is the problem, which is that the Torah does a thing that you see in a movie, in an actual movie all the time, which is a flashback scene, and it goes backwards. And so my understanding is that the rabbis said, they had to say like, oh, this is a great example of how the Torah doesn't always work in chronological order. The problem then became, to your point, Judy, that once you say, well, this scene in the movie is out of order from the way it happened chronologically, you can do that anywhere you want. And that's what the rabbis wind up doing. They state that categorically, and then they start playing around. Now, I just did a text that I'm working on with another colleague on Tuesdays that sometimes comes up in my Wednesday Chassidut class, which is the Or HaTzafun. And the Or HaTzafun is breaking down this whole section about Abraham in the tent, right? And the three visitors who come to him. And there's a huge, I mentioned this, I think, in the other class, but there's this huge problem that happens there, which is Abraham busts out lamb and then also feeds butter to his guests. And the question then comes like, wait a second, Avram Avinu is breaking the laws of kashrut. And there are two answers that your rabbis can give. In the Gemara, they do this. One set of rabbis says, well, of course he gives them lamb with butter. There's no laws against dairy and meat at the same meal yet. That's fine. But the rabbis who are very strict on Ein Mukdam U'Meuchar b'Torah say, of course, Avram Avinu kept all 613 commandments, right? That would be crazy. So of course, he had already been given the revelation at Sinai, And so therefore, this line in the Torah, we actually have to read it as there were two separate meals. One that was just dairy, and then afterward, then they ate the bread and the butter. They benched, they washed their hands, they did Nagelwasser on their fingers, and then they went back.
They waited 6 hours.
They don't have to wait 6 hours from dairy to meat, but then they waited, and then they waited like 15 minutes, and then they ate meat. Anyhow,
and Yaakov went to the yeshiva.
Right, exactly. Okay, Elisheva, you had a question.
Just a quick question on our side topic. I always thought that people who wore both sets of tefillin put on Rabbeinu Tam for a moment, took them off, and then put on Rosh.
That might be.
I never heard that they did them both at once.
That might be. The next time.
That would be very cumbersome.
So the problem for me, Elisheva, is so when I was in Israel, the last couple times I've lived in Israel or visited Israel, I used to be okay going to mechitza minions where men and women weren't counted equally. And I don't think I'm going to do that anymore. So I'll probably never be anywhere with someone with Rabbeinu Tam tefillin ever again. Because I've literally never met a non-Orthodox Jew who does Rabbeinu Tam. But I will, if I know anybody, the senior rabbi here might actually know that. So I will put a note in my head and say, Rabbi Adelson, can you tell me some of the minhagim of Rabbeinu Tam tefillin? And if the answer is no, I have no idea what you're talking about, then, so.
I can also consult Rabbi Google.
Yeah, it's an interesting question as to whether Google will give you good information about, could be,
Depends.
We'll find out. Okay, let's keep going on this. We've gotten through one sentence, 2 sentences. I love this class. Okay. The Gemara notes that Rabbi Yossi's formulation, if he concluded, indicates after the fact, yes, ab initio, no. So what they're going to do here is they're taking this statement that I would interpret as a disagreement about what you should do with the final line of Malchuyot, Zichronot, and Shofarot. And the argument being, one rabbi says you can conclude any of those with prophets, and the other one says, no, you have to conclude with Chomesh. And saying, no, that's not an actual argument about what from, before thought you should put in. Rather, it's if you do it accidentally and you finish with the wrong line, what you do, right? meaning that Rabbi Yossi is saying your 10th line should be Torah. This is the Talmud's understanding of this, if you screwed up and did Torah instead of what you're supposed to do, which is prophets. Now, the reason I have a hard time with this is that it assumes that your Machzor doesn't have these verses in it, and that you're not reading these verses out of a Machzor. Now, it
But
also
in those days, they didn't all have a machzor.
right. So not everyone was literate, but the other thing is we're also assuming
There
even
was no
Elisheva,
printing press.
right? But Elisheva, even to your point, even if just the Shaliach Tzibor had a written text, I think what we're implying here is that the 10 verses was like a period of study that you did during the Musaf, right? That like Malchliot Zichronot and Shofar was a moment where like kind of like a freestyle Tachanun or a freestyle early morning study, bless you, where everyone's like, they would declare time out during services and everyone would sit down with the Chumash and then they'd say, okay, pick out 3 verses of Torah, 3 verses of Nevi'im, and 3 verses of Ketuvim with these lines in them and go back, right? Or, the rabbi would say, all right, we're on Exodus 16, verse 18. And Moses said when he arrived at Sinai, da, 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 da. And then the rabbi would call out the next line, right? And then they would do like that, like maybe they, in this freestyle recitation, you would pick the wrong verse. Otherwise, it's kind of confusing. Now, like trying to understand this, 2,000 years after the fact is hard. Elenit, go ahead. Do you have a postulate?
No, I don't know how like anachronistic we're being when we're like trying to think of them. They're like, oh, there is one person who is leading and directing everyone. Like, oh, that person would have a printed text and the other people wouldn't have a printed text. Like, I don't necessarily feel like in Mishnaic times that was the way that prayer services of all these things happened. Like maybe I'm wrong, but like I don't think they're all not coming together like we do from a printed machzor and like going through, I don't know, maybe I'm wrong, but I don't have the sense of like, well, certainly you said the rabbi, certainly not the rabbi, but like whoever is the leader. No, I knew you were using the rabbi as like the but I don't know. That's not my sense of like, maybe I'm wrong. I don't know.
Well, I'm not sure if you're arguing which direction you're arguing about the concept of anachronistic of like, is this, do you think it's even less clear than what I've described or
yes, I don't think that there was I don't think that there was like, oh, we are doing the davening and now we are taking a break to do learning. Yeah. Like I think like I don't think that there was it was just part of it. Like I don't think that it was like, oh, until now we were doing this, like everyone was davening together and there was literally a tzibor. Like I don't think that's, I don't know.
You're saying it's even less clear than what I'm kind of throwing out there. I agree with you. I'm just
I don't think it was actually a tzibor with a printed text to like.
Well, so the one thing I'll object to, and it's not a strong objection, because assuming that the entire Talmud hangs together and everybody in every Jewish community was knowledgeable of all of the Mishnah or all of is definitely not true. But like the concept of Shaliach Tzibor does exist in the Talmud, that it's in Brachot somewhere. But like your point is still well taken, which is I'm just throwing spaghetti at a wall to see if it's done, right? Like to figure out if it sticks. And this one is this really strange, thing where it's like, it's really unclear what they're doing here and how exactly it functioned. And the Gemara is kind of making that argument also, which is the Gemara is, to my understanding, really trying to clean up this sloppy, funky little piece where it feels like it's open season on what you want to do with your 10 verses for Malchliot Zichronot Shofar. That the 10th is Ali oxen free. You can do whatever the heck you want there. Although clearly, oddly enough, you can't do Ketuvim. Why? I don't know.
Well, I don't know if that's necessarily what they're trying to clean up. They're trying to clean up this contradiction between the word Yotze. Is that what he says? It's not. It's not scrolled up, but and whether like
yeah.
Right. I mean, I think that there's still, especially in the Mishnah, they're really, I feel like it's, I don't know if we talked about whether this is, prescriptive or descriptive of what was actually happening in terms of like trying to like set, what actually happened during these Rosh Hashanah services.
Is it,
I agree with you. And so I highlighted it on the board because it was a good pickup, Eleni. And it wasn't that I didn't realize it. It was mostly just like, we can say all the things and stay on this paragraph all day long, but we should eventually move on.
I
But
think
the
that's I think that's the objection, right? Is he
The
when
key
he's
word, right? The key word is whether the word yatzah is really important in this sentence or if it's by the by. If it's really important, it means you fulfilled your yatzah, meaning the word to go out, right? If you go to Israel and you're trying to find your way out of any restaurant, yitziah is the exit, right? Yatzah, you've fulfilled your obligation. Is this very specific and does it have real force of power? Or is it just by the by? Does it mean like, yeah, this is how you do it? Or is it you fulfilled your obligation, comma, however, there's a better way to do it, which is the other way to understand yatzah. And that's the way the Gemara is taking it.
well, it's the contradiction between Yetzah and Mishubach. That's the contradiction.
Except, yes.
That's not like, is it by the by, but is it like those are two different things.
I
Yes.
think so. I wouldn't say it that way. Meshubach for the rest of us is this is praiseworthy. This is the right way to do it versus this is a way to do it, but not the ideal way to do it. I would say there's Yatzah and Meshubach as one way of understanding it, and the other way is, there's not a better way and a worse way. It's just the way to do it, which is that Rabbi Yossi is objecting to the Mishnah, which is the way I understand it, right? And the Gemara is attempting to harmonize Rabbi Yossi and the Mishnah in order to help the Gemara come up with a resolution and a conclusion that allows us to move on with our day without, having a knockdown drag out about. The other thing that the Gemara is often trying to do is say, well, why would Yossi logically object to something that the Mishnah would say, considering that the Mishnah is powerful and authoritative, and it's Rabbi Meir was probably is the stam of the Mishnah, right? It's one of those questions about whether something is settled law or not, and the Gemara is often trying to make it all seem like, well, the Mishnah never really contradicts itself and it's all settled law. But my postmodern learning of this is that the Mishnah was in development, and so Rabbi Yossi could have done things different in his community than Rabbi Meir did in his community, and the objection is there so that that it's a dissenting viewpoint, right? All right, that's more information than you all needed. Let's finish the section off, and then Rav Judy question. But isn't it taught in a Baraita that Rabbi Yossi says one who concludes with a series with a verse from the Torah is praiseworthy? So that's where Eleni is talking about, which is the concept Hareza Meshubach. I was being here now, Eleni, which is that the objection above of the Gemara was where I was at that point. So, so he's saying that this version of Rabbi Yossi is implying that his way of doing things is Meshubach. Now, this is basically my way of, I was saying, this is Eleni's way of saying better what I said earlier, which is it's either Meshubach and Yatzah, or this is the right way. This is the only way to do it. And it's, for me, it's like, it's two different ways of saying the same thing. Say that the text of the Mishnah must be modified so it reads, Rabbi Yossi says he concludes with a version of Torah, i.e. one should absolutely do this. All right, Judy, go ahead.
What would be, so Mishubach Yotze is the right way to do it, right?
No, Yatzah is.
Mishubach is the right way to do it. Yotze is, I would use the word for Yotze, the English word acceptable.
That's a good translation.
Rather than what you said, because it's a little less critical.
Right.
But it's saying, it's not the best way, but okay, it's fine.
Yeah, that's a great translation of Yatzah if you're holding kind of what we talked like, but that's actually part of what the debate is about whether the concept of Yatzah means it's good enough or it's acceptable, or whether one could interpret it to mean you're done, you're good, right? It's not just acceptable, it's Rabbi Yossi's way of fulfilling it. Now, the way the Gemara,
it's just, in other words, it's just as good.
Right.
It's just another way of doing it.
So Eleni's understanding of Talmud and my understanding of Talmud are and I know this because I've known Ilanit in this class long enough to know her. Ilanit is probably smarter and more precise on Gemara than I am, in the sense that Ilanit looks at it as a series of logical proofs that must all cleanly harmonize with each other. So each line needs to be very clearly a change in the logical proof or the logical function of the previous line. It must modify the. I look at it as like cholent, right? It goes into a pot and it all comes out pretty good in the end, but it doesn't all like. I don't necessarily put my spoon in the cholent and say, this carrot is delicious. It's all cholent, right? Like, so for me, the debate is a little bit sloppier, and I'm okay saying that. Maybe that's because my brain is sloppier, or maybe it's because I have a bachelor's of arts from, a liberal, academic study, which is to say, we are arguing about whether you should do it one way or another, and whether it was intended to be that way from the beginning or whether after the fact you fulfilled the obligation. The specifics of exactly how the language pulls each section out and how the Gemara may confront or go back on an individual given statement are immaterial to me. It's all cholent. Cindy wants to say something, and then we'll keep going.
I want to go back to Yatsah. So, and you actually just said the word that I think is most important with relationship to that. So Yatsah implies that there is some kind of an obligation. So in other words, there was a mitzvah, there was a commandment to do something, right? Otherwise you wouldn't have Yatsah, right? So, so I think when we see that word Yatsah, we can't just say, well, this is an acceptable way of doing it. No, that's not it. It's like, did you fulfill your obligation or did you not fulfill your obligation? Right.
Cindy's
so pretty important.
Right. Cindy's making the argument that the word yatsah is an important word, holds the force of logic, and says you have fulfilled your obligation, meaning this is good. You're good. Move on. Right.
It's something that you were required to do and you have done.
Yeah. It's something you're required to do and you have done.
You get the bracha, whatever.
Yeah. You score your mitzvah points, right, and you move on. The reason that the rabbis of the Gemara are arguing it a little bit is that they read yatsah as a technical term, which they often understand as you fulfilled your obligation, comma, however, right? But I'm saying, and this is kind of counter to Elon, or this is counter to Elanit's argument to some degree, and counter to the Gemara's own argument, like, that's only because the Gemara chooses to read it that way. I'm mostly Team Cindy on this one, which is yatsah to me is an important word, which means you can move on. Now that's because I'm lenient and I hold by Rabbi Yossi on this one. I feel like Rabbi Yossi's position makes more logical sense because I'll be honest, I would prefer to finish with something from the Chumash than something from Nevi'im. Why? I don't know. That's just how I get down. Olivia, go ahead.
Can you remind us what we need to be yotze on? Like what are we fulfilling?
Yeah, it's so niggling. It's so niggling and so minor. Yeah. It's so niggling and so minor what you're supposed to fulfill. The question is, what is the 10th verse of your Malchuyot, Zichronot, and Shofarot of the Musaf? And why would it be better if it was, or not really why, but shouldn't it be better if you do it from Nevi'im, from prophets? No, says Rabbi Yossi, it would be better potentially if you concluded with a verse from the Chumash, from the Torah, right? And that's what they're arguing about, right? And whether that's also a priori or ab initio, or a fortiori or a priori kind of set of logic. All right. We have beaten this one to death, folks. Let's move on before my brain explodes. But this is, it was a good argument, but it's a good section. All right, Marion, you're going to take this next. Vaha, okay. And of course, because it's Talmud, we're never really done. So we're not actually done yet. Vaha, im hishlim katani, di'avad in, v'hatchila la hachikamar, ma'atchila b'torah u'mashlim b'navi. Rabbi Yossi Omer, mashlim b'torah. Im hishlim b'navi, yatzah Tanya nami hachi, Amar Rabbi Elazar barabi Yossi, Vatikin hayu mashlim oto b'Torah.
The Gemara raises a difficulty. Doesn't the Mishnah teach, if he concluded, that this indicates that after the fact, yes, one has fulfilled his obligation. Ab initio, no, he has not fulfilled his obligation. The Gemara answers that this is what the Mishnah is saying. One begins with verses from the Torah and concludes with a single verse from the prophets. Rabbi Yossi says, one concludes with a single verse from the Torah, and if he concluded with a single verse from the prophets, he has fulfilled his obligation. This is also taught in the Baraita. Rabbi Elazar, son of Rabbi Yossi, said, pious individuals, Vatikim, who were scrupulous in their performance of mitzvot, would conclude the series with a single verse from the Torah. Presumably, Rabbi Elazar followed the opinion of his father, Rabbi Yossi.
Great. So we have a kind of a conclusion that I think maybe satisfies us here, but also this starts to spell out a little bit the fact that, remember, one of the first things I said to start this class was, this could be that you're going 3, 3, and 4, right? So that it's Torah, Ketuvim, Nevi'im, or that it was like 3, 3, and 4, potentially. This is a little radical, but it's possible. Nevi'im, Ketuvim, Torah. But now we're starting to understand, at least the way they're framing it here, is that it's the 3, 3, 3, and 1 formulation that I was talking about before. But I think you can make an argument for any one of these kind of variables being thrown in there. So ultimately they say, if he concluded after the fact, yes, ab initio, no, right? So we're kind of continuing with this idea. And then the Baraita that comes at the end, Rabbi Elazar, Sabbath Rabbi Yossi said, Vatikim would conclude with a single verse from Torah, means that Elazar holds like Rabbi Yossi. So that's another like support. But again, because it's not what the Mishnah says, it could be read going backwards as an understanding that this is not the ideal way to conclude. It's Yatzah, but not Meshubach, as we were talking about before with Ilanit. All right. I don't know that that whole section added a whole lot to our understanding. It's just a continued thing. And that's the thing that the Gemara does sometimes, which is continue to talk in order to make sure we're kind of clear on the thing. But by the way, what we did as a class was effectively do quote unquote outside what the Gemara just did inside, right? We debated the idea of, you know, before and after Yatzah and Meshubach, and we had a good robust discussion, and the Gemara had it too. And now we're kind of back. So, and the only piece of information we added there was Rabbi Yossi's son held like his father, which, God, I hope my kid holds like me when we're older. I have no faith in that whatsoever, right? My kids just got back from a Reconstructionist Jewish summer camp yesterday. And I kept saying to my wife a couple of years ago when we started to think about summer camp, like, how about Ramah? And my wife was like, how about this other camp? Right? So nobody holds like me in my house. Okay. All right. With that, let's see. Noreen, would you do me the favor? We're just going to do the Carmiel 3. You weren't the next window in the thing, but I wanted you to read it anyways. So I'm going to do the Hebrew for 15, and then you're going to do the English. Bishlama zichronot v'shofar ikatuva, ela malchuyot tlatu dehavin. Adonai Elohav imo utruat melech bo, vayhi bishurun melech, Adonai yimloch leolam va'ed, va'anan ba'enan eser v'leka.
The Gemara asks, granted, it is possible to conclude remembrances and shofarot with a verse from the Torah. Oops.
Sorry.
It's okay, as there are many such verses. However, with regard to kingship, there are only 3. The Lord his God is with him, and the sounding of a king is among them, and he was king in Jeshurun. And the Lord shall reign forever and ever. And we require 10 verses. And according to Rabbi Yossi, there are not enough, as he maintains that one should recite 4 verses from the Torah, the first 3 and the concluding one.
All right. This is wonderful because it does at least 2 things for us. The first thing that it does for us is it tells us a very valuable piece of information that I probably wouldn't have known otherwise, which is that the word melech in the context of God does not appear 3 times in the Chumash. It does not appear 4 times in the Chumash. It only appears 3 times. So even if I wanted to say that the concluding verse of our 10 was from Torah, like Rabbi Yossi wants us to do, I couldn't, because there isn't even a verse to pick from there. Now, is this true? I don't know. I actually want to go and look this up as soon as class is over. So if any of you know how to search in Hebrew for this, feel free. Now, the thing that I wanted to add, just to make sure that you get this clearly, is it's got to be the word melech in regards to God, right? I'm sure the word melech shows, I mean, last week's Torah portion had Melech Og of Bashan and Melech Sichon and all these other melechs, right? You know, but that don't count here. We're talking about God as melech. The second thing that this does, and then Judy, you can ask your question, is, and I'm sure most of you have already picked this up inherently, is this very clearly is what we call a kasha to the position of Rabbi Yossi from the Gemara. The kasha being, you can't conclude with Torah when you do Malchuyot, right? You can do it in Shofarot and you can do it in Zichronot, but you cannot do it in Malchuyot because it doesn't exist, right? And if it doesn't exist, you can't do it. And clearly this slugs up your opinion completely, right? That's actually, by the way, the real function here, which is this is the Gemara trying to lay out Rabbi Yossi and like hit him with a knockout punch, right? By the way, Rabbi Yossi, I'm going to tip you off a little bit. He's going to duck and dodge here. He's going to bob and weave, baby. He can't get hit. He's going to get out of this. So don't worry. If you're worried about, whether Rabbi Yossi can survive this knockout blow, do not worry. All right, Rabbi Judy, go ahead.
So, I can't believe that's a knockout blow, but what they're citing here is 3 verses where Melech and Adonai go together. But the third one doesn't say Melech. The third one says the Lord shall reign forever and ever.
Right. But it does
so if he's citing that as an example, then there's got to be other examples.
Right. So
am I making sense?
Yes. So it's the word yimloch, which is a verb instead of a noun. So I think
okay. So yimloch is Exodus 15:18 in Hebrew is yimloch.
Yeah.
Yes.
So,
Okay.
Right.
Same root.
No, but I think you
Right.
make a good point, which is you could make that argument, by the way, which is there's really only 2, because yimloch is a verb, but not a noun. But the rabbis are promiscuous with their verses. We saw a couple weeks ago that they use some ideas that encapsulate something, but don't actually say the thing explicitly. The one that we debated, we spent a lot of time on 3 weeks ago was the word pakad, and if it could stand in for zichron. So that's what I mean when I say the rabbis are promiscuous with these verses. I hope it's okay to say the rabbis are promiscuous. If anyone just wanted to go back to the video that I post online and just cut and edit the words of Rabbi Goodman saying the rabbis were promiscuous and then send it to the rabbinical assembly and get me disbarred. I have the tape. I'll show the whole thing. Okay, go ahead, Elisheva.
Yeah, in English, it sounds like there's a problem whether you talk about the king or you talk about reigning. But in Hebrew, it's the same root. It's as good as the same word.
That's right.
Exactly.
That's right. Well said. All right, let's get the exciting conclusion out here because this is a fun a fun objection, which again gets to the point before about Zichron and Pakad. Okay, short little piece. Olivia, do you mind reading this? Amar Rav Huna Tashma Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad Malchut Divrei Rabbi Yossi Rabbi Yehuda Omer Eino Malchut.
Rav Huna said, "Come and hear a solution from that which is taught in the Tosefta." The verse, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one," the Shema in Deuteronomy, is a verse of kingship. And that's the statement of Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yehuda says that is not a verse of kingship.
Great. Okay, I'm going to explain one little thing that happened here, which would have flown over all of your heads, I think, which is, so it says Amar Rav Huna. Rav Huna is in Amora. And then the rest of his statement is quoting two rabbis, Rabbi Yossi and Rabbi Yehuda, who are both Tanas. So they're earlier rabbis. So what is Rav Huna doing here? He's bringing a verse from Tosefta to make his argument, to prove his point. And the verse from Tosefta says, actually, there's a debate amongst two Tanaitic rabbis as to what could possibly qualify as your fourth verse of Torah, right? The fourth verse of Torah that he quotes, which would support Rabbi Yossi's position, is Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad. Again, the rabbis being promiscuous with the literal usage of the word. So back to your question, Judy, although Judy's on the phone. Back to your point, might be on hold with the pharmacy. It's okay. Or with her broker, right? Judy, buy. The market is at the bottom. You got to buy right now. Don't sell. Okay. So the question being, Shema Yisrael Adonai, does that count as Malchut? And Rabbi Yossi says, yeah, like this is the essential line of kingship of God, right? For those of us who want a spiritual message or a practical religious message from today's Talmud teaching, right? Shema Yisrael Adonai Eloheinu Adonai Echad as the essential quality of God's kind of rulership and kingship over the universe is a really lovely idea, even though the word melech never appears. Rabbi Yehuda, of course, objects and says, I'm a literalist. If it doesn't say the word melech, it doesn't qualify as a verse. But you see again that the rabbis get creative with what they think a verse. If a verse encapsulates the emotions, the ideas, the principles of a thing, but doesn't literally say the thing, some rabbis think it's okay, and others think, for the birds, it doesn't hold up for me. All right, let's keep going. With that, Paula, you'll read for me, and the rabbis are just going to continue playing with words and wondering whether something needs to be literal or not. Vayadata hayom v'hashivota el levavecha ki Adonai hu ha'elohim ein od. That will sound very familiar to you. It's a piece that gets chopped up and thrown into Aleinu, right? Malchut, divrei Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, eino Malchut. Ata hareta ladat ki Adonai hu ha'elohim ein od milvado. Malchut, divrei Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yehuda Omer, eino Malchut.
Know this day and lay it to your heart that the Lord, he is God in heaven above and upon the earth beneath. There is none else. It's a verse of kingship. This is the statement of Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yehuda says it is not a verse of kingship. To you, it was shown that you might know that the Lord, he is God. There is none else beside him, is a verse of kingship. This is a statement of Rabbi Yossi. Rabbi Yehuda says it is not a verse of kingship. This shows that according to the opinion of Rabbi Yossi, there are sufficient verses of kingship in the Torah to recite 3 at the beginning and 1 at the end.
Great. So we see this fight that Yehuda and Yossi are going through. Yehuda, and the Gemara agrees with him at its first objection, says, no, you can't conclude with Torah. You have to conclude with something from Nevi'im. And one of the proof texts for that is you can't find 4 verses on from Torah that mention Malchut. There only are 3, right? And Yossi says, well, how about this one, Shema Yisrael? And Rabbi Yehuda says, you can't use that. And then Rabbi Yossi replies and says, well, how about this one? Hu Adonai Ein Od. And he says, you can't use that one, right? That's Yossi's, Yehuda's objection. He says, oh, you don't like that one? How about this one? And he brings another one and he says, you can't use that one. And ultimately, it becomes an academic argument where both sides stick to their guns and we have really no good resolution. So that's it. That's where 32, that's the end of our sugya. So where we've left off, one could argue any which way, right? I think one could make a cogent argument that Malchuyot, Zichronot, and Shofarot should conclude with a verse of Torah, or that they should conclude with a verse of Navi, depending on which opinion you hold by. I am pretty sure that we conclude with a verse from Navi'im, and that we don't hold by Rabbi Yehuda, but I didn't have time to look it up today, so I'll take a look at it for next week, hopefully, and let you know. All right, let's keep going. We'll go a little further because we made some good progress today, and Mishnahs are always fun to chew over. Also, we should feel really good. We should pat ourselves on the back. We've done a lot of work today, and we've concluded a lot of things. Ilanit says, I looked it up. The 10th is the Shema from Torah. I was wrong. The Mishnah loses. Rabbi Yossi wins. That is very interesting. Olivia says Rabbi Yossi does not get eaten by the eels at this time. That, I believe, is a reference to Princess Bride. Is that correct, Olivia? Well done. He doesn't get eaten by the eels. Great. Going backwards a little bit, Ilanit asked, how common were printed machzorim in Mishnaic times? I think you were saying that either facetiously or just throwing that out, because I don't think, so first of all, the printing press wasn't invented for another 1,000 years after the Mishnah. Ilanit knows that. So it would have been hand-scribed, and only the very wealthy could afford hand-scribed texts. So I would say the masses generally didn't have text at all. But it was a more oral culture. So people were really good at memorizing stuff, unlike Rabbi Goodman, who literally can't do, anywhere past the 5th bracha of the Amidah for a weekday if he doesn't have the text in front of him. My brain just doesn't work that way. Text is training wheels for me, and I desperately need it. So, okay. One more comment, right?
We're desperately supposed to have it.
Good. Yes. So Ilanit's saying when the leader used their printed text to know the order of the verses. Yeah. Thank you, Ilanit. All right, let's keep going. But thanks, Ilanit, for letting us know how we hold today. It's funny, as I was saying it, I was like, I don't think we conclude with a line from Nevi'im, but I'm sure we hold by the Mishnah, and I just kept going. So thank you. It's a team effort some mornings, right? I lingered too long over my whitefish salad that Dee provided us at Morning Minyan, and only spent 10 minutes prepping the daf, as opposed to my usual 30 minutes. So I blame Dee for all of it. Okay. There were too many fish options this morning at Morning Minyan. Okay. With that, let's do, the kugel was very good, and she sent me the recipe. Let's see, Rav Judy's gone offline. Ilanit, do you mind reading this Mishnah for us in the English?
Read.
Yeah.
Ilanit's got it. Ilanit's
No,
got it.
Judy can read.
No, Ilanit after you.
All right. Sorry, English or Hebrew?
Why don't you do both? That'll be fun.
All right. How verily fnei hateva biyom tov shel Rosh Hashanah. Oh, sorry. Yeah, biyom tov shel Rosh Hashanah hasheni matkia uvishvat hahalel harishon mikrat hahalel.
Great.
With regard to one who is passing before the ark as prayer leader on the festival of Rosh Hashanah, is the second prayer leader, i.e., the one who leads the additional prayer, the musaf. No, the addition.
Keep going.
Who sounds the shofar on behalf of the congregation. Sorry, I'm trying to go back to the Hebrew. And on the day when the Hallel is recited, the first prayer leader, i.e., the one who reads the morning prayer, recites the Hallel on behalf of the congregation.
Great.
This is interesting. This is
yes. So Ilanit, why don't you explain to everyone? You can be the rabbi now. Why don't you explain to everyone why this is interesting?
Oh, because now Rosh Hashanah, even though we say Hallel on other Rosh Chodesh and Yom Tov, we would say Hallel. We do not currently say Hallel on.
And why is that?
I don't know. We're going to find out, I guess.
That's right. Very good. So the Mishnah has done, Eleni, well done. Thank you. And I'm glad you read that because you were reading it with like, what the hell is going on? This is crazy pants weirdness, right? There's every word that just came out of the Mishnah here is a hot mess on two levels, right? One, it's unclear. And so it's the Gemara's job to clear it up. And two, some of it is just, for those of us who know what Rosh Hashanah looks like, is patently wrong or patently wrong for us. And that's one of the reasons why Tractate Rosh Hashanah is so much fun, right? Which is to say that the Gemara in Rosh Hashanah, the Talmud in Rosh Hashanah, provides a lot of information of stuff that we don't do anymore, right? For instance, it says, on Rosh Hashanah, we blow a shofar and two dudes roll up next to the shofar with trumpets and they blow. And the first time you read that in the Mishnah, you go, Habadawa? Like, you're like, we don't blow trumpets during the shofar service, right? And then it says, right, here's how you blow shofar on Shabbat. And for all of us, we go, Habadawa? You don't blow shofar on Shabbat. Everybody knows that. But the Mishnah says, yeah, you do. But it's only by going through an entire sugya of Gemara that you find out that actually you don't do that. Here's another one. The Gemara, the Talmud tells us, you know, here's the parts of the shofar that you're allowed to plate in silver or gold when you are plating your shofar with silver and gold. And we all go, Habadawa? You don't plate your shofar with silver or gold. Like, there's not parts on it that you should or you shouldn't. You just don't do it, right? It's like not a thing, right? So now we have one more, right? Which is the one that Eleni said, which is when you do Hallel on the first day of Rosh Hashanah. And Eleni stopped in her tracks and said, Habadawa? By the way, I'm quoting Elmo. So that's Grover in Sesame Street says Habadawa, which is we don't say Hallel here. And I know why, Eleni, because I've done this entire tractate before, but we will learn in this sugya why. And I bet you, by the way, your rabbi has mumbled this from the Bima at some point in all of your lives. And most of you have either forgotten it or you're just holding on to it till when we get to it again to say it again. The other thing that I'll say, and this will conclude our class from the day, is this first part. So the words are ha'over lifnei hateva. So in the Talmud and also in later codes, the phrase for shaliach tzibor that's used interchangeably with shaliach tzibor, representative of the community, is ha'over lifnei hateva, which is a really interesting phraseology because it's about the physical position of the person who leads services, right? And when I lead services, it does come to mind, which is I'm the only guy who's standing between the Bima and the Aron, right? I'm standing in front of the Aron Kodesh, which feels a little, it's like a little nerve-wracking when you do it for the first time, like, oh my God, the Holy Ark, right? So there's this weird piece here where it says, the second prayer leader, Hasheni, and Eleni said, that must be the Musaf. And then Eleni said, maybe it's not the Musaf. I don't know, and felt guilty about it. We're going to, because Mishnah, we're going to live in the wonder right now. We're going to live in the I don't know. And we're going to ask that as an open question. What do they mean, the second prayer leader? Do they mean that it has to be the Musaf person? Or is there some other understanding of a second prayer leader that could possibly use? By the way, a lot of congregations have Birkat HaShachar and Psuket Zimra, and then that person walks off, and then someone else comes into Shachrit, and that person walks off. Someone else does the Torah service, and that person walks off, and then a Musaf. So we don't really know how it's broken down right now. We can assume, but we're not sure. The piece that makes this a little bit extra weird, and we'll conclude on this, is that the second prayer leader is also the person who blows shofar. And again, I don't know about in your home congregations, I've never seen that before. And I've never heard before that the Musaf person is also obligated into Kiyah Shofar. I think we're kind of living in a world where there are two people at services who know how to lead, and you basically are arguing The second guy, and I do mean guy in this gendered kind of understanding of ancient Israel, should know how to blow, should be the one to blow shofar. And the first guy should be the person who does shachrit. Why? I don't know. Maybe the Talmud will address this for us. Ilanit, you get the final word.
Well, I wonder why, if it's often the case, and I think we do not do this at Beth Shalom, but I think at many shuls, the person who is the tokeya, who blows the shofar, does lead the verses around there, starting with like Lama Natseach and the call and response. Because I think it's not just blowing shofar. There is, and for whatever reason we don't do this about Shalom, but at most shuls I've been to, I think that is the case. I don't want to say most, many shuls that is the case, that the shofar blower does have a section to lead, and I'm wondering if it's because of this.
Yeah. So I only know this from Erie because when in the last 3 years I've been the kolbo, I've done everything, which means that there was no second person, so that solved that problem. But the 2 years before that, when I led with a cantor, this is going to be funny, this is the only part of the service the cantor would let me lead. He wouldn't let me do anything else. He wouldn't even let me do Mariv at the end of Yom Kippur. Like, the dude had to do everything. But he would let me do these verses here, I think. So maybe he knew this Gemara really well, and I just didn't. But I've been a kolbo my whole career, and most synagogues also, they know that all of this stuff is such a heavy lift that they split it up for people, that it's just impractical to say, we're going to have 2 people do everything for the next 6 hours straight. Like, that's a little nutty. All right. Thank you all for being here today. I like ending on a Mishnah because it ends in a place where we're like, yeah, we don't know. I think it's really fun to say, we don't know. The Gemara is going to try and make it make sense, but living in the wonder is a good way to live in the world. All right. We'll see you all next week. I will be back from Los Angeles, slightly jet lagged, but always ready for Gemara.